So when you look at section 9.3 with AP Human Geography, it predominantly out of the textbook, it looks at, the various different types of agricultural practices that are practiced around the world. And I'm not going to make a lot of videos on those. I just don't feel like, I need to rehash word for word all the different types and why they're located and the pros and cons. I think the book does a pretty good job of that. But one thing I want to talk about in particular is the von Thunen model. All right, and that looks at, predominantly commercial farms in, the western part of the world. So think, Europe, the United States, other parts of North America. But it also really does apply to, local, just any local commercial farms and why those are located where they are. And so while this isn't as big of a deal due to new technology, think like, refrigeration, the new transportation, of like, roads, railroad, ships, planes, things of that nature, it's still important to look at because in many cases, this is where we see certain farms to where they are. So that's just kind of what we're going to look at here with this von Thunen model. So like, then we're using dairy farms as the example because it'll tie into the idea of a milk shed as well. So the von Thunen model is a agricultural model that shows the proximity from the distance of the farm to the market influences what the farmer is going to grow and make the most money. So based on where that farmer is in comparison to where they're selling it, whether that's a city, a town, market, business, whatever, that might produce like animal feed or might be a slaughterhouse or something, or processing plant, whatever, is going to depend on, or the farmer is going to decide what they're going to grow, what they're going to raise based on those factors. All right. So the further away it is, the less expensive the travel costs are going to be. And also the longer it can actually wait until it actually, gets turned into some sort of food or be sold and still be healthy. Okay, so the idea is that it was created, again, in, about 200 odd years ago, but because it was, related to, transportation and preservation of, preserving food so it didn't spoil. But it still has, again, like I said, some actual characteristics that are still relevant to us today. So here is the actual von Thunen model. You can get two versions, modified with a river, and then just not. So in the middle, you have your town and or city, and in that first ring around it, you have what the horticulture and the dairy. So think, your fruits, your vegetables, cows, milk, cheese, things of that nature, that if you don't eat it right away, or if you don't create it right away and then ship it and sell it and consume it right away, it will spoil. Think about, what happens to milk when you leave it out, for a couple of hours and not have it in the fridge. It's going to spoil and it's going to taste not very good. Same thing with, if you don't, really look after your vegetables. There's a reason why they're only grown for a certain part of the year in many of the places around the world, and why, again, you keep them refrigerated, and eventually after a few days or so, they will go bad. So the further away they are, the less likely you are to eat it and get a healthy version of it. Okay. Then, in typical, cities in Europe and then also in the United States at this time surrounding that was, kind of your forest areas. So think, this is where you might have, some pastures, some woods, things of that nature. You might cut down some trees, for timber and for housing and for heat and things of that nature. And that could be really difficult to actually, move. So you don't want to be too far away from it because, again, if you're in Minnesota at the time that I'm recording this video, we are so many days where it's at or below zero right now. And so, again, if you need, to cut down a lot of wood in order to keep you and your family warm, you do not want to be too far away from it, because that's very, very cold, and then it's also not easy to lug around, again, back 200 odd years ago, either in your hands or with an animal. You don't want to go too far if you don't have to. So that's why it's going to be also very close to the city. Then kind of in, outside of that forest area, you will have, crop rotation. So this is where you'll have, your fields, and you'll be rotating those crops every few years. Think, shifting cultivation. So you use, like maybe a third or a fourth of these fields, every year or two, and then, you shift, let it grow, let the fallow grow, let the nutrients be regenerated, and then move on, and then, do another part of those fields. Then you have an enclosed field around that, again, to kind of cut off from the area, to give it, again, more, protection, things of that nature. And then you have another enclosed field around that, and then you have grazing land for, animals, cattle, things of that nature that need a lot of feed in order to sustain themselves. And so that's kind of the whole setup here, is that, yeah, the meat might spoil, but it's also the stuff that's going to need more land, and you want to keep that stuff away from your other resources, all right? So obviously, The milk shed would also, as we said here with the horticulture and dairy, be there too. And then, yeah, animal grazing is out here with this fourth ring or fifth ring, whatever you want to look at it, because it's essentially, really, really, they just need a lot of, space. So, because again, animals are going to constantly need to eat and be fed in order to grow, get fat if you're going to cut them up or, use them for other things. Well, not for other things, but if you're going to continually use them for meat and milk, or for shearing, for wool, things of that nature, they're going to constantly need to be fed. So, especially if you like the idea of free range. So the idea of the von Thunen map is so with this is kind of a very precise idea here. It's obviously not true, but you're using the United States with the von Thunen model. I found this out of I found this online a few years back. But it's the idea that New York is the only market. Okay, assuming that New York is the only market that you're going to be selling things to. Okay, crops are ranked by their rent-paying ability, and obviously there's no climate or terrain variation under these assumptions. So your veggies and dairy is going to be really, really close to the market. Then your cotton and tobacco, kind of your export crops, corn and soybeans, wheat. Again, the easy things to move around. Beef, cattle, and sheep, kind of out here in the west, and then your forest areas where you don't really need to move that around as much because again you have forest areas in this area. Okay, and then obviously this accounts more for terrain, not no terrain variability, but climate variation in terms of like, okay, what do we actually experience here in the United States, where you have different climates, temperatures, things of that nature, rainfall amounts, whatever. So it's a very interesting thing to be considering. So, and then the idea again of dairy farming, bringing that back. To the idea that milk production is normally or used to be very, very close to the market because again milk would spoil very early. So that's kind of the idea of the von Thunen model. And also in this, we've also talked about a few of the other ideas of shifting cultivation. Talked about a little bit about horticulture there, animal grazing, mixed crop use in animal farming because again, oftentimes you're growing crops to feed the animals and it's not just about ranching. Okay, it's a mixed use of that land. So that covers a lot of the different types of commercial farming. Not very a lot of the subsistence, but the commercial stuff is covered pretty well in that conversation. So that's where we're going to leave it there. And again, make sure that you're looking up the other stuff in the book, and specifically, again, the more subsistent agricultural practices that are found globally.